My name is Polly Baca, and I graduated from Colorado State University in 1962. And at that time, my family was living in Greeley, but then we moved to Thornton, and I now live in Denver, downtown Denver. Colorado State University changed my life. When I came to this campus, I was a physics major. I had done well in the sciences, and at the time that I started college, there was a great interest in Sputnik and in space. So I thought I would major in physics and be the first woman in space, be the first woman astronaut. Shortly after I got on campus, however, another interest of mine became fairly evident. A friend of mine asked me encouraged me to run for secretary of my class, and I did, and I won. And then I got involved in Young Democrats and what became super involved, was a parliamentarian, and then I was vice chair, and I got involved in what we call the ideal political party for people on campus. And so all of a sudden I'm majoring in, I'm not majoring, but I'm so active in politics, on campus. And one of my professors, who was he was not yet my academic advisor, he was a history or a civics professor. And he asked me what I was majoring in. And I said physics. And he, of course, taught civics and history. And he asked me if I had ever thought of changing my major. And I said, what would I change it to? And he said, political science. And I said, can you make money in political science? And he kind of laughed. And he said, well, yes, I do. He was a political science professor. And quite frankly, that sounded pretty good to me. So I changed my major to political science, and I got super involved. As a matter of fact, when I was, as a sophomore, I was vice chair of the Young Democrats, and I got involved in putting together this mock national Democratic nominating convention. The Republicans did it too. We had a foundation that funded our conventions that we had. It was a 4-state area. We invited the students from high schools and colleges to come to Colorado State University and as delegates to these mock presidential nominating conventions, the Republican and Democrat, and pretend like they were going to nominate the next president of the United States. And it was amazing. It was very successful. We nominated John Kennedy for president and Stuart Symington for vice president. But nonetheless, what happened was that our convention was so successful that my academic advisors by that time and our sponsors of the Young Democrats, I had applied for an internship that summer, but as a sophomore, they said I was a little bit too young, but they came to me and they said, you've done such a great job, managing this convention. We're going to see if we can get you that internship. And they did. They went to bat for me. I got an internship to work in the 1960 Democratic Party offices. And of course, who was running for president of the United States in 1960? It was John Kennedy. So I had the chance to meet all of the Kennedy brothers, and that led to my getting a job right out of college in '62 in Washington, D.C. with a labor union. So that's how Colorado State University changed my life. It was the interest of those professors in what happened to me. In 1958, when I started as a freshman, they had just changed the name of the university from Colorado A&M, Agricultural and Mechanical College, to Colorado State University. I was the first freshman class to be at Colorado State University with that name. And the campus, quite honestly, the men outnumbered women at that time 7-1. And there were no people of color on campus, very few of us. There were a handful of African Americans and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 Latinos, hardly any at all. So it was a different experience for me, but it was a good experience because I learned how to work, with people from all different kinds of backgrounds. And I had friends from all different, my college, my roommate, when I was in Allison Hall, the very first year it was built, and my roommate was from Chicago. And so I had a wonderful time, learning how to relate to people not like me, but for people who had a different experience. And what I learned was that we all have challenges in life, but we need to learn how to listen to one another and how to communicate with one another. And my experience on campus was one of growth and learning and coming out of my shell, because I had been very much of an introvert. And I learned how to work with others. I had once, in high school, and when I first started, I had a bit of it as a minority woman, a Latina. I had a little bit of a inferiority complex, I think, or felt a little bit not treated well, or whatever. It was some concerns that I had as an individual. It was on campus where I learned how to relate to others, and where I learned that if I worked hard and I studied, that I was respected and people would vote for me. And part of that was learning how to just treat people as individuals. And yes, I had some bad experiences because I'm a Mexican-American woman. There were some that negative experiences because I am Mexican-American, and there were some rude people that treated me with disdain. But I also found that there were a lot more people who were treated me as Polly Baca, and were not put off by the fact that I was a Mexican-American woman. One of my favorite traditions was that as a sophomore at Colorado State University, I was a member of SPUR. It was an honorary society, but and it was those of us, I think, that had gotten a certain grade average or something of that nature. But our job was to paint the A on the side of the mountain, and it was, we went up on a Saturday morning and we whitewashed, the A, and that was fun. It was really an exciting time. There were so many. I mean, I think in my, I think it was my third year, I became an Aggie Angel. And in those days, women were not really allowed into the services as where you could advance. You couldn't advance the way you can now. There was a bit of discrimination against women, but we got to be in this honorary society with the men who were in ROTC, and we were called the Aggie Angels, and we marched with the men. Those of us that were honored to be in that special group. I have often been asked if I had any mentors, and no, I didn't have any mentors. There were people that were nice to me and that helped me. Primarily, my high school physics teacher took an interest in me, and so did my English teacher, but my physics teacher encouraged me to major in physics. When I was on campus, it was both my physics academic advisor, Dr. Weber, who the building, Weber Building is named after, was so excited about having a freshman physics major, female. I was the only female freshman physics major at that time in 1958. That he was just so kind and attentive, and I honestly don't think he actually, the third quarter, he got a fellowship to teach in Pakistan, so he had to leave the university for a couple of years. I think had he stayed on campus, I wouldn't have had the courage to change my major, because he was so excited about my majoring in physics. But it was then Dr. Lee Sefkin and Dr. Will Irwin, my two professors in political science, that encouraged me to change my major to political science and helped me get that internship, that changed my life. I mean, it literally led to my getting a job after college, when at that time it was very hard for Mexican Americans to get jobs in Colorado. It was a difficult time for us because of the bigotry that existed. Where a lot of the northern, a lot of the agricultural communities, the towns like Greeley and Fort Collins, the churches were segregated, we couldn't sit in the center aisles with the main population. We had to sit on the side aisles or in the back of the church. I couldn't, when I graduated from CSU and applied for a job as teaching in Denver, I applied a little bit late, and the quota for hiring Mexican Americans as teachers in Denver had been filled. And so it didn't matter what my qualification. I graduated with honors, but I couldn't get a job teaching. So it was, I was very fortunate that I had made those, that I had gotten exposed in 1960 and had networks that helped me get a job back east. And that was, I was so grateful for the opportunity. But what I realized is that, I was scared to death. I had never been east of Cincinnati. I'd gone to Cincinnati once with a girlfriend at Christmas time. But I had never traveled. I had never been on a train or a plane or a ship. I'd been on a bus once to Pueblo, and that was it. And so here I am. I get on my first plane ride where, you dressed up in those days, heels and hose as a young woman, and you had to climb the stairs to get on the plane. And there were no direct flights to Washington, D.C. You had to go through Chicago. And as I got on the plane, it was a plane full of white men and me. So it was, and I didn't know anyone in Washington except for my boss. I'd met him on one occasion when he interviewed me. And what I'm really saying to young people now is, when those opportunities present itself, take that risk. It leads to exciting times. So don't pass up those opportunities just because you're scared. I was scared, and I cried myself to sleep for 3 months when I first, every night when I got to Washington, D.C., but it was all worth it. All kinds of opportunities opened up after that. It's amazing what can happen to you. But take that risk. Grab hold of those opportunities when they present themselves, and you will have an exciting life. And I certainly have. It's been an amazing life. In 1963, I had the opportunity to march with Martin Luther King on the March on Washington. And it was an amazing time because everybody was afraid. They said they were closing down all the offices. They said there might be riots in the street because it was going to be March on Washington. And I because I was putting out this newspaper, I received this announcement about one of the unions needed help handing out coffee and donuts to the marchers that were coming in from around the country. And you could volunteer to do that. So I did. I got on a bus that morning, or I took my, I did get on a bus and went from my home in Arlington, Virginia to Washington, D.C. and volunteered at this, area, the station. I think it was the Statler Hilton Hotel, where I participated in handing out coffee and donuts to the marchers. And then when I finished doing that, when after they had pretty much ended, all the buses had all of their marchers had gotten off the buses, I joined them and went to, and marched, on the mall. And it was, it was beautiful. It was, it was full of love that day. Nobody was angry. It was just all love. The interesting thing was that the city of D.C. normally was 80% white and 20% black. On the day of the March on Washington, it was 80% black and 20% white. Because I was still with the labor unions, I met Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and I worked with them and helped them organize. I became I was the head of the boycott committee in Washington, D.C., the Huelga committee. We were boycotting grapes at the time. So there were exciting times. And then I went to work for Bobby Kennedy. No, I went to the White House. I was recruited to go by the Johnson White House. They were starting a new agency called the Interagency Committee on Mexican Americans. And they needed some PR people, or someone as the public information officer for that agency. And at the time, there were only 3 Mexican Americans in Washington, D.C. that were writers, that had PR experience. One of them was already working for EEOC. Another was, I think he already had a very good job. And I did too. I had an excellent job. But I was recruited away from the unions to go work for the White House as an information officer. At that time, I was the highest paid Mexican-American woman in federal government as a GS-13 at 26 years old, 27 years old. And then I was recruited away from the White House to help Bobby Kennedy when he decided to run for president. And of course, that was because of my relationships with the Kennedy family and the folks that were supporting them. And so I went to work for Bobby, and I was the National Deputy Director of Viva Kennedy. And in that capacity, they sent me to Los Angeles, to help organize the LA, East Los Angeles. And while I was there, I put out a newspaper for Bobby. And then when that was done, Cesar Chavez and Brooke Corona were our two co-chairs out there in California. So I worked pretty much, I staffed Cesar. I just did what he told me to do. And so after putting out the newspaper, I helped Cesar and Bert and others do the field operations, go door to door. And then, of course, that night I was at the event at the Ambassador Hotel where I was living, and wasn't that far from the senator when he was assassinated. And that, of course, was another pivotal point in my life. That was why I came home, because it was so devastating to me to have that experience. It was my hero, had been assassinated. So I was angry, and I actually gave up on politics for a while. But you can't just give up. You cannot just let things go. When you know that you can help make a difference, you have to stick with it. So a lot of after that, I came home and ended up in Arizona actually to help start what became the National Council of La Raza as one of its original staff members. And after that, I met and married my former husband at that time, and then came home to Colorado. And 2 years later, I was asked to run for the state legislature, and that's how it all started. After Bobby's death, I took off to Central America, or South America, Venezuela, with a friend of mine. When I came back, another woman friend called and said, "Paula, you have to come to the Democratic Convention." I had been at the 1964 Democratic Convention as a young citizen for Johnson. And so this was 1968, and she said, you have to come because I've got a room, you can share the room with me, and I'm working for the convention. So, and you need to get re-engaged. So I went, and I ran into a lot of my Kennedy friends, and we decided to have a demonstration for Ted Kennedy. And so, and every night I had a guest badge because of the work I had done around the country. I knew somebody in all the different delegations, so somebody would always get me a guest pass to get into the hall. And then I was snuck onto the floor almost every night, but this particular night I was, because we were doing the demonstration for Ted, I ended up in the California delegation standing on a chair with a sign over my head. And unbeknownst to me, of course cameras were going off all over the place. Well, this photograph appeared in Newsweek and also on the front page of the New York Daily News. I'll send you a copy of that photograph. Some friends of mine, found it for me, and so I have that. But here I am, demonstrating. So I was back into it for a while until I went off to Arizona to help start what became the National Council of La Raza, called Unidos US today. It changed its name over the years. But it's what I've learned is that life doesn't go in a straight path. It's not about succeeding as you go along the line. It's about as you're moving along in life and your good things are happening, you hit some challenges. I don't care who you are, you will hit challenges in life. But the key is to grow from those challenges. to not let the challenges defeat you. You have to get involved and learn from those challenges. And if you can do that, the next round that you make, because it's cyclical, will be even higher. You will go even higher as a result of those challenges. If you don't have challenges in your life, then you can't learn. You can't grow. At least I don't think so. I might put it another way. You can grow more from the challenges if you learn how to deal with it and not let it stop you. It can lead to great successes. And mine always did. After every challenge, it seemed like it was a upward spiral, and good things happened. What was so important for me as an elected official, and important for others that I served with, was honesty. You had to be honest. If you gave your word, you lived up to your word. And if you had to, for example, if I told somebody that I was going to vote for their bill, and I then changed my mind, if somebody came along and convinced me otherwise, it was my responsibility to go to the sponsor of that bill and say, look, because of X, Y, and Z, I can't vote for your bill. I'm going to have to vote against it. It was a matter of integrity and a matter of honesty. And if you were dishonest, if you tried to con somebody, you lost your influence. It was a time when it was important to be, your word was what you had and what gave you that trust as an elected official. And the same thing with your constituents. If you told your constituents you were going to do something and you changed your mind or something happened that you had to change your mind, you had to get out there and tell them why. You had to tell them, I know that I was inclined to support X, Y, or Z, and after learning about why, A, B, and C, I've changed my mind. And it's okay to change your mind when you grow. The more information you get, the more input, it's going to have an influence on what you decide to do. And that's okay. The key is to just be honest about it and transparent about it. And that's when you can go, when you start gaining, at least in my experience, that's when you start gaining the respect of your constituents and of others. And you could move along, in terms of, in the political circles. But those that were dishonest and that played games and tried to con, they never went anyplace. I'm not sure I can say that totally now, in 2021. Politics in the last decade are not what they were prior to the last decade, and I'm disappointed. We have elected officials now that lie. We've had elected officials in the past 5 years, in the highest levels of government, whose word you can't trust. And I find, back in the day, you could trust what you heard on the news, and I'm not so sure that it's good that we have social media, that you can't check out the facts, because it's so important. Facts are important, and it's important for you to be able to relate the truth. And I fear for our democracy if we cannot agree on what the facts are and know that we have to tell the truth. I have a great faith in our democracy. I was very active in the 60s, and a lot of folks thought it was, terrible times, and there were the riots and the burnings and all kinds of things that were happening. We overcame the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy in the 50s and the 60s, and we were able to develop a kinder nation, in the 70s and 80s. What I worry about, I do have faith in the American public and American people, that they can see through the falsehoods, the false claims. What I pray for is that they have the courage, that our elected officials have the courage to stand up against falsehoods and stand with the truth. That's why I encourage young people, get involved in politics now. We need you. And we need you to run for office, but remember to be honest. tell the truth, and you will go much farther than if you start lying. It really will eventually come home to hurt you if you lie too much. I'm very fortunate in that Sonia Sotomayor is like my sister. She is very close to my younger sister and her husband. As a matter of fact, the three of them met on a trip to Israel in 1986. They had never met before. And Sonia ended up being the Cupid, playing Cupid between my sister and her current husband. And so she then became a part of our family. She always came to all of our family events. I'll see her, as a matter of fact, at the end of the month because my brother-in-law's birthday is on Halloween. And so he always has a Halloween party. He turns 80 on Halloween this year, so it's going to be a big party. And of course, Sonia has always been to all of them. Actually, now you can always tell if she's there because there's somebody there with an earpiece. And that's security that always comes with her. And, she's an amazing woman. She has such high integrity. She is someone who you can believe always. She always tells the truth. And she had a rough childhood. But as she says, her childhood and her dreams are what inspired her to succeed. And I think that's true. She had more challenges than most people could ever, really overcome. But she persisted. And I think that's the key word, you persist. Even though you run into those difficulties as a young person. She persisted. She got a scholarship to Princeton. And then, because she couldn't have gone to college without a scholarship. She lived in the projects in the Bronx with a single mom, and so she and then she went on to Yale on scholarship, and then became a New York attorney. And she had some elected officials who got very interested in her. And I remember when my brother-in-law was the one that said that if we ever get a Democratic president, Sonia will get nominated for the Supreme Court. And I said, really? Because Sonia was just Sonia. She was my friend, just like you have your girlfriends. So he then when we did, when Obama was elected, yes, Sonia was in the final 6. And I thought, oh my gosh. And they started talking about her background. I said, I didn't know that. She's really smart. And I really didn't realize that. It wasn't anything that ever occurred to me. She was just Sonia. And so then I got called by the FBI when they were vetting her. And I called my sister right after that call. I said, Betty, she's one of the finalists because they're vetting her. The FBI just called and they wanted to know what I thought, et cetera, et cetera. And sure enough, within about 3 days later, the president announced that he was appointing her to the Supreme Court. So we were all excited. And she's been wonderful as a justice, as a Supreme Court justice. You never talk to her about any cases. I'm a close personal friend. We'll never talk to her about a case, which is why I didn't even tell her that I was on this court case, when we sued on the Electoral College. I knew when I did say to the attorneys, when they asked me to be part of the suit, and I said, well, I do have a friend on the Supreme Court. Does that matter? And they said, no, it doesn't matter. It'll be okay. So I never thought anything more of it until it got to the Supreme Court. Then all of a sudden somebody called and they said, did you know that Sonia recused herself because of you? And I said, oh, wow. But that's her integrity. Because I was her friend, she didn't feel that she could rule in that case because of me. She ruled in our sister case, but not in this one. There was the Summit of the Eight that was coming into town, and I was the by that time I was the regional administrator for the General Services Administration, and we were responsible for securing all the federal buildings. Well, I got a call one day, and they said, well, it was from the White House. It was a woman from the White House, and she said, Polly, the president would like you to come to dinner at the Oxford Hotel, this evening. He's inviting some folks to dinner. And I said, and she said, and you can bring a friend, you can bring someone else. And so the gentleman that I was dating at the time, I called him and I said, do you want to go to dinner with the president tonight? And he said, of course. Now, I just assumed it was going to be a dinner of, with 100 people, in the ballroom there at the Oxford Hotel. It never occurred to me that it would be just a small group. And so we went and they told us what to do. When we got to the hotel, we didn't say that we were there to meet the president. We said that we were checking in for dinner with the woman who had called me, who I knew at the time. And they said, okay, and they ushered us to this small room with a long table that seated maybe 18 people, 9 people on each side. And we thought, well, this is the holding room that you go to before you have a big meeting. So we stood there and we were standing around talking. I was co-chair of the president's campaign in 1992 for president. And my colleague, who was my co-chair, was there as well. And so we thought, well, it's just, and then in walks Hillary with a couple of folks, that we knew that were in town. And so we all started talking, and we're starting to wonder, aren't we going someplace else? Isn't this, and then in walks the president with his, with 2 or 3 folks. And so it was, we were getting to be maybe 10, 15 people there. And then pretty soon he said to Hillary, do you think we ought to sit down? And she said, yeah. And so all of a sudden we realized we were going to, this was where we were going to have dinner. So I said to my friend, where do you want to sit? He said, I want to sit across from the president. And I said, okay. So he sat right next to Hillary, who was sitting across from the president. And I sat there next, and it was so much fun because he was just in a jovial mood. He went around the table. They were talking about that, what had happened that day. And when we had to order, he went around and he was asking folks, what are you going to order? Because we were ordering off the menu. And so it was just a fun time, that it was just, just casual. It was just eating dinner with a friend, with a few friends. And Federico Pena was there, and it was, and a variety of other folks, Jim Lyons and a lot of folks that were good friends of the president. The next day in the newspapers, it said that the woman who owned the Oxford at the time, Dana Crawford, that her staff had called her and said, you would not believe who just came in, because they didn't know the president was going to be there. It hadn't been swept, it hadn't been secured, but he like he told the Secret Service, if you didn't know I was coming, who else would know? Nobody's going to hurt me here. So, it was an exciting time, but it was probably not the kind of dinner you ought to have very often without having presidents ought to have the place secured. But Bill at the time, President Clinton at the time was, I think he was just in a jovial mood, and he just wanted to have dinner with some friends. And so he just made the Secret Service let him off, at the hotel. And of course they, I think, followed him and secured the room. But it was fun. It was a fun time. I think what I would tell a young Polly Baca, who was a freshman at CSU, was, work hard, study, get the most out of this moment in time, out of this day here on this campus. Learn as much as you can, because it will help you later on. You never know what's going to be presented and what opportunity you're going to have. So take it all in stride, but no, there's so much more to come. So prepare yourself, study, learn as much as you can, because you might run into somebody, a few years from now who you had read about, or someone who is related to, it's going to help you. Just make use of this day and be in the present moment and work as hard as you can, but also be kind. Be kind to others. it's, bullies are not, they might have some success as a flash in the pan. But the reason my friends have advanced, and I've had 3 friends that have been, well, I worked for Lyndon Johnson, and as a public information officer, I was Jimmy Carter's Rocky Mountain States coordinator, and it was the only time I was in the residence at the White House upstairs when we had a meeting there. And of course, Bill Clinton, who was my friend. All of those folks were presidents because they cared about people. Especially Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton really had a big heart for people, and they treated people well. They weren't bullies. LBJ was a little bit rough, gruff, but that was his nature, and he got things done. But Jimmy Carter always made me feel like I remember one time at a convention before he ran for president, he was thinking about it. And I said, I heard, I saw him we were at some event, and I said, Governor, I heard you might run for president. And he leaned over and he said, yes, I'm thinking of doing that, and I'd really like your support. But he said it very quietly, not for the whole room. And of course, Bill Clinton, we were both on the Democratic National Committee in the early 80s, and he had lost his race for governor in 1980. He had been elected for 1 term, but then lost in 1980. So he was just a member of the DNC. And I was running for vice chair of the National Party. And he was why he was sitting in this group that were helping me, there was maybe about 10 of us in a circle. And I remember him saying, we were trying to figure out how many votes I had and what I had to do. And I remember him saying, well, you've got Arkansas. Arkansas is going to vote for you, but do you want me to see if I can scare up a few more votes in the South? And I said, yes, I'd really appreciate that. And he did. So he helped me get elected vice chair of the National Party. I was the first Latina to actually be elected as vice chair of the party. There had been another Latina that had been appointed. When you've got the presidency, then you can they appoint the officers. But when you don't have the presidency, and at that time, Ronald Reagan was president, so it was a free-for-all. You had to campaign for the position. So it was, and then I was reelected, and then I co-chaired both I think I'm the only Latina who's ever co-chaired 2 national Democratic conventions. I co-chaired in 1980 and 84. But Bill Clinton was the one that helped me get there. So of course, when he ran for president, Hillary called and asked me if I would co-chair his campaign in Colorado, and I said, of course. Of course, you help friends out. And that's another quality that good politicians do. They remember when you've helped them, and if they can help you back, they do. If they can't, they tell you when they can't, because you can't always. But those are some good qualities. Remember your friends. Remember who helps you. But always, more important, just be honest. And if you can't support somebody, a friend, tell them why. Just be transparent. Be honest. And it's okay if you can't do something. What I think is so important is that it's okay to fail. I ran for Congress twice and failed, but I never regretted running. And when those opportunities present itself, go for it. And if you don't win, okay. You learn from it, and something else might come along. But you can't always be safe about everything. And don't worry about failing. If you did your best, you still learned. So it's okay. And that's something I don't think most of us realize, that life is not a straight line. It's cyclical. There are ups and downs and circles and what have you. And it's okay. Just keep learning and keep growing and meeting those challenges and not worry about it. Just, learn every time you have a challenge. And don't let it get you down. Don't let anything defeat you. Just go forward. But don't worry about failing. It's okay. It's not the end of the line. Sometimes better opportunities present themselves after you fail. Well, I ran for Congress in 1980 and 86. And then I went to work for the president in 94, so it didn't stop me. I still had this amazing experience working at the White House. So you never know what might come along, So had I won my congressional race, I wouldn't have ever worked at the White House. I mean, for Bill Clinton at least. So life is good. Life is good. Just remember to not abuse it. Live life to its fullest, but be honest, be transparent, and know that it's okay if you don't always win. It's not about winning. It's how you play the game. But what it is, it's not about the terms that we use. It's how we identify, and being proud of whatever community you come from, being proud of that ancestral identity,